So where were we? Yes. War. Again. If I had learned anything through my research of the decades that were the 50s, and then the 60s, and then the 70s, is that I learned that America and the world are obsessed with two different types of things. The world is obsessed with the idea of war, and America is obsessed with changing its presidents. I mean, America went through 9 presidents during the Cold War, and then most of them were 4-term presidents, and the only 2 that were not, one was assassinated, the other one ended in a scandal, and then you had Ronald Reagan, who was just the only one who had a full 2 terms. With North Korea being a communist country and helped by the Soviet Union, and South Korea being an anti-communist country and helped by America, these tensions of government caused a big conflict that led to war. Okay, so the world is at war again. 2 countries, North Korea and South Korea. North Korea was communist, South Korea was anti-communist. Soviet Union helped North Korea, while America helped South Korea. The Soviet Union and America were not friends, they were not allies, they weren't even really acquaintances. They kind of were enemies. A lot of tension separated the 2 countries after World War II. After World War II, Japan, they had this Korea peninsula, and when Japan lost, they had to give up the land, so that's why these 2 countries got it. And when these 2 countries got it, they decided to set up their own government regimes because they felt that both their governments were superior to each other. The 30th parallel was the only thing separating these 2 countries and these 2 governments. On June 25th, 1950, 75,000 soldiers from North Korea poured and invaded and crossed the 38th parallel to get into South Korea. This was the start of the Korean War. Now, don't take North Korea invading South Korea as they're the bad guys and South Korea's the good guys, because neither government was really a good government. I mean, yes, South Korea had an anti-communist, but it was an anti-communist. It was still run by a hardline dictator, same way as North Korea was still run by a dictator. Syngman Rhee set up an anti-communist regime in South Korea. It was still a dictatorship, though. He was still a dictator. And this was the People's Republic of Korea. Then you had Kim Il-sung set up a communist regime up in North Korea. He was a dictator as well, but he set up just a different type of government. This was backed by the Soviet Union, just like how America supported South Korea. North Korea was given the name of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is ironic. Now, since the war has ended, North Korea has continued on with its dictatorship government. They are very, very secretive. They're very highly protective of who comes in and who comes out of this country. As you can see from this video, this was actually from the 2020 military parade during the coronavirus. None of the people wearing masks, probably because I don't think there's one person in that country that has coronavirus. They're very secretive, they're very contained with their people. They don't like to let people out. They don't really like letting people in. It's, it's a dictatorship. Though some people think it's communism, it's not communism. As you can see from that clip behind them, there was a hammer and sickle, which is a symbol that is regularly, talked about alongside with communism. This war kind of reminds me of a civil war. It was not a world war. That's why there's not as many countries as there were in World War I and II. But there was a allyship in there that's not technically a country, and that's the United Nations. The United Nations was an allyship made up of several different countries around the world, and was a replacement for the far less powerful League of Nations that was created after the First World War. Okay, we need to make a thing that will stop Germany from taking over the world. And that's a fantastic idea. Anyone understand why we would do that, though? Because Germany's a bitch and likes to take over countries. We cannot let it happen again, so this is why we need to do this. Oh, can we call it the League of Nations? I like that name. It has a nice ring to it. League of Nations. Something that totally won't fail in the future. I can't wait to protect the world with my 3 best friends. Our bond is so strong, nothing can break us apart. Especially now Germany coming for revenge after we take away all its money and all its soldiers and all its military. Nothing will break us apart. Well, you know what they say. If it doesn't work the first time, you can always try the second time. Sorry, Great Britain. Before the United Nations, there was the League of Nations. This allyship was made to try to prevent another world war from happening. As you can see, that absolutely failed. Anyway, this had 4 permanent members: United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Japan. This whole allyship began to crumble down when the actions of World War II came around, because Italy and Japan went on the side of the Axis powers. United Kingdom and France went on with the Allies. It split up, which caused many problems. The falling of this League of Nations caused the United Nations. As you can see inside the United Nations now, there is America, which is actually a permanent member. The League of Nations didn't even have America as a member. America decided to stay out of it because they figured it would be for the best. Speaking of America, let's check in and see what they're doing.
Back to the American home, with welcome and well done everywhere. And what does he want? Most of all, he wants a job.
As talked about in the previous video, the American soldiers coming home from the war in Europe would return to change throughout the country. Things were changing from the workforce to the home front. Pretty much America was all about change in the 1950s. That was a huge thing back then. This period in time was considered the post-war era. This was the era after World War II. This also was considered the golden age, the age of new technology, new life, new change, a new America. Though America protects South Korea is not like Puerto Rico, where Puerto Rico is an American territory. South Korea is its own country. So really what was happening on the other side of the world really did not concern America. America was getting involved more so because they were afraid about the spread of communism. They feared that if enough countries became communist, it would be enough to be able to take over the world and change the entire world into one huge communist superpower. America did not want to simply ask the Soviet Union to stop because they knew the Soviet Union would say no. So instead they decided to go spread their own influence. Reason why West Germany had a different government than East Germany. What at the time seemed like a simple solution actually just escalated the tensions even faster between the two countries. This would lead to the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And in 1962, it would lead to a near-nuclear fallout event where an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and spotted Soviet nuclear missiles that could reach the East Coast. Today, it's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United Nations put together a group of 16 countries. This included countries like South Korea, America, and Great Britain, and they went to go fight North Korea, China, and Soviet Union. Because we live in a world where we believe there needs to be 25-on-1 teams. I mean, this whole war freaking ends in a stupid stalemate anyway. I mean, we didn't even come up to a peace treaty until like 2018. That could be the story right there. Communism was spreading, America didn't like it, a war ends in stalemate, peace treaty in 2018. That could be the freaking video. But you know, I'm doing the whole video. I'm going to explain more than that. Sorry. Let's just get back to the video. Okay, so I set up some teams here. We have the United Nations, which is the green. And let's see, what can we call the tan soldier, which is like North Korean stuff? I know, the red force. Yeah, that's bad fucking ass. Alright, you two, get fighting. Okay, so basically, a lot of the fighting took place on the 38th parallel. This is basically the imaginary line that divided the two countries. Today it's known as the demilitarized zone. There's something very similar to this line back then, and there was the 17th parallel, which is the imaginary line that divided North and South Vietnam. When the North invaded the South, they were able to capture this key city of Seoul, South Korea, in a matter of days. When the United Nations came, they worked round the clock. They fought hard in order to recapture that city, in order to keep it from being under the rule of North Korea. Though there were other battles within this war, the first, second, and third Battle of Seoul were the most prominent. A lot of this war was a back and forth type of thing, one side would capture the country's territory, then that country would push back. This is pretty much what it was like the entire war, and it all took place really on that 38th parallel. So North Korea invaded South Korea, and with help of United Nations forces, South Korea was able to retake Seoul and invade into North Korea. But then Soviet Union and Chinese forces arrived, and they were pushed back to the 38th parallel. This stalemate would last until the end, when a truce was signed, not necessarily ending the war, but simply just putting a halt to the fighting in the country.
On 20 September, almost 3 months after the North Korean communists launched their invasion, United Nations troops are in the first stages of their all-out drive toward North Korea.
When North Korea invaded South Korea and took their main city of Seoul, South Koreans knew that they needed to get into that city in order to overtake it before North Korea gained too much power. Because if North Korea was able to keep a hold on that city, South Koreans knew that they would be able to have enough strength to overpower their government and win the war. When the United Nations arrived, they were able to retake the city of Seoul, replacing the dictator of North Korea with the original dictator of South Korea. And because of this, South Korea was very sure that they could keep pressing on, and they did. But what happened was a mix of Soviet and Chinese forces backed up North Korea, which led to a stalemate because they pushed back the United Nations and South Korea all the way back to that 30th parallel. And because of this, they couldn't have enough strength on either side in order to push forward on either side, leaving a stalemate and eventually what would end the war. Now I know what you're thinking. Why the hell is this bitch talking about the 38th parallel so much? Well, let me say that the 38th parallel is very important to this war because that's where a lot of the action happened. That's where the stalemate happened. That's pretty much where the war ended. Though the fighting portion of the war only lasted from 1950 to 1953, the official peace treaty was not signed until 2018. The war was never as big as the World War I and World War II, the Vietnam, but it still was a war that deserves to be recognized. When you hear about wars from the Cold War, you usually think of Vietnam before you think of Korea. But really, they are so similar but so different. There is a Korean War Memorial out in DC, and if you're ever out there and you get a chance to go see it, I recommend you do. I recommend you go there and you pay the respects to the fallen victims and the veterans that helped serve this war.
Greatest headlines of the century. Dateline and Montreal, August 5th, 1953. In a moment, the story. Hours after the signing of the armistice in Korea on July 27, 1953, the final artillery shell of the campaign was fired with a rakish gesture by the weary Union.
The Korean War was the first major war within this whole communism versus capitalism event, known as the Cold War. The war that would follow after it, just 2 years later, would be even worse and would end up in a defeat for the Americans. The Vietnam War started in 1955 and will last a near 20 years. Though it started in 1955, I've decided to take the Vietnam War and make its own series, which will be released in 2021. With the Korean War over, I think it's time that we take our boys home so we can experience some of the iconic American culture that the 1950s had to offer.
You wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. Anything your heart desires will come.
We read in the newspaper, hear on the radio, they're fighting in Korea. The boys are called to go to meet